Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the horrific secrets of the Lafferty family in 1863 Utah that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. I'm just Christine, and if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. There are nights when the wind itself seems to carry secrets, nights when the world holds its breath, and the darkness presses in, thick and suffocating, as if it means to smother every last whisper of hope. On such a night, in the dead of winter, a girl appeared at the edge of civilization. Her silhouette wavered in the storm's fury, hands clutching a battered journal as if it were the only thing anchoring her to this world. Snow clung to her hair and lashes, turning her into a ghostly figure, half real, half legend, as she stumbled through the doors of the sheriff's office in a remote Utah settlement. Her arrival was not merely an interruption of the night's silence. It was a rupture, a wound torn open in the fabric of the ordinary, through which something unspeakable began to seep. What could drive a child to flee into a blizzard, risking death by cold and hunger, rather than remain in the warmth of her own home? What horror, what secret, could be so unbearable that the only escape was through the heart of a storm? The sheriff, a man hardened by years of frontier justice, would later recall the look in her eyes, not the wild panic of a lost child, but the haunted, hollow gaze of someone who had seen too much and survived only by the thinnest thread of will. The journal she carried, its pages swollen with ink and fear, would become the key to a mystery that had festered in silence for years, a mystery that would soon unravel the very soul of Hollow Creek. The world into which this girl emerged was itself a character in the unfolding tragedy. Hollow Creek. In the winter of 1863 was less a town than a scattering of stubborn lives clinging to the edge of the American wilderness. The valley lay cradled between the Wasatch Peaks, its only road a treacherous pass that vanished beneath snowdrifts for months at a time. The settlement's buildings, rough-hewn and weather-beaten, huddled together as if for warmth, their windows flickering with the uncertain light of oil lamps. The silence here was not peaceful, but oppressive, a silence that seemed to listen, to judge, to remember. According to records from the territorial government, Hollow Creek was founded by a handful of Mormon families seeking refuge from persecution and the chaos of the wider world. They brought with them not only their faith, but their fears, their superstitions, and their longing for a promised land where God's law would reign supreme. Yet, isolation, as history so often teaches, is a double-edged sword. It can protect, but it can also imprison. In the absence of outside scrutiny, the boundaries between piety and fanaticism, between discipline and cruelty, can blur until they are all but indistinguishable. The winter of 1863 was particularly harsh. Snow fell early and often, sealing the valley off from the nearest settlement for weeks at a time. Supplies dwindled, tempers frayed. The sense of being forgotten by both God and government grew heavier with each passing day. The people of Hollow Creek became a world unto themselves, their customs hardening into ritual, their suspicions of outsiders deepening into paranoia. It was in this crucible of cold and isolation that the seeds of darkness took root, nourished by fear, watered by silence. Within this world, the Lafferty homestead stood apart, both literally and figuratively, perched on the highest rise. Its three interconnected buildings formed a triangle around a barren courtyard, their windows set like watchful eyes upon the valley below. The main house, larger and more solid than its neighbors, was a fortress of sorts, its doors barred against the wind, its walls thick with secrets. The compound's design, according to local rumor, was dictated by visions and dreams, its every angle and corridor imbued with symbolic meaning. To the casual observer, it was simply the home of a prosperous family. To those who lived within its walls, it was something else entirely. Obadiah Lafferty, the patriarch, was a man whose presence filled every room he entered, even when he stood in silence. In his youth, he had been known for his generosity and eloquence, a merchant whose word was trusted as much as his coin. But years of fasting, prayer, and self-imposed exile had carved away the softness of his features, leaving behind a visage that seemed chiseled from stone. His eyes, deep-set and stormy, missed nothing. His beard, streaked with premature gray, lent him the air of an Old Testament prophet, stern, unyielding, and convinced of his own righteousness. Those who encountered Obadiah in the early days of Hollow Creek remembered a man who could quote scripture with effortless grace, who spoke of charity and community, who welcomed strangers to his table. But as the winters grew longer and the world outside receded, something in him began to shift. He spoke more often of angels and revelations, of the need for purity and sacrifice. His sermons, once filled with hope, became warnings of judgment and doom. The line between spiritual leader and autocrat blurred, then vanished. Martha, his first wife, bore the marks of this transformation more than anyone. Once celebrated for her wit and kindness, she now moved through the house with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned to anticipate danger. Her hair, once golden, was pulled back in a severe knot, streaked with gray that seemed to multiply with each passing season. Her eyes, once bright, had dulled to the color of old glass, reflecting not the world as it was, but as it had become within the compound's walls, narrow, shadowed, and full of unspoken rules. The other wives, Rebecca and Sarah, followed Martha's lead, their movements synchronized in a silent ballet of submission. Rebecca, a widow drawn to Obadiah's reputation for holiness, had come seeking solace and found only a different kind of prison. Sarah, the youngest, had never known any life but this one, her innocence both a shield and a curse. The children, a spectrum of ages and temperaments, bore the invisible scars of a world where obedience was survival and questions were dangerous. Yet even in this house of silence, there were cracks, small, almost imperceptible fissures through which the light of doubt and defiance sometimes flickered. Ezekiel, the eldest son, carried his father's build but none of his certainty. Fear had carved lines into his face, and his hands trembled when he wrote in the leather-bound journal Obadiah insisted he keep. Miriam, at 17, was different still. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's stubbornness, but she had turned these gifts inward. using them to build a secret world of observation and memory. It was Miriam who first noticed the subtle changes, the way the prayers grew longer, the punishments harsher, the rituals more elaborate and less comprehensible. She watched as her siblings retreated into themselves, as laughter vanished from the halls, as the air grew thick with the weight of things left unsaid. She began to write, at first as a way to make sense of the world, then as a means of survival. Her diary became a lifeline, a record of the days and nights that blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. There were other signs, two signs that something was deeply wrong. The windows of the temple building, once open to the sun, were now shuttered at all hours. The courtyard, once a place of play, had become a no man's land, watched over by Obadiah's most loyal followers. The children spoke in whispers, if at all, their eyes darting to the corners of rooms as if expecting to see something lurking there. Even the animals seemed to sense the change, their movements skittish, their eyes wide and wary. According to the recollections of Dr. Samuel Hayes, one of the few outsiders ever permitted inside the compound, the atmosphere was charged with a kind of nervous energy, as if the very walls were listening. Hayes, a physician with a keen eye for human suffering, noted the pallor of the children, the bruises that appeared and vanished, the way the women flinched at sudden noises. He wrote in his journal, "There is a sickness here, but it is not of the body. It is something deeper, something that seeps into the bones." The contrast between the Lafferty family's public face and their private reality was stark. To the world, they were pillars of the community, devout, industrious, generous. But behind closed doors, the rules were different. Obadiah's word was law, and his law was absolute. The rituals he devised grew stranger with each passing month, their purpose known only to him. The line between discipline and cruelty, between faith and fanaticism, blurred until it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. Miriam, ever watchful, sensed that a storm was gathering, not the kind that howled outside the windows, but one that brewed in the hearts and minds of those trapped within the compound. She saw it in the way her mother's hands shook as she poured tea, in the way Rebecca's eyes darted to the door at every footstep, in the way Sarah clung to her youngest brother as if he were a talisman against the darkness. She felt it in herself, a growing sense of dread that no amount of prayer could dispel. And so, as the winter deepened and the snow piled higher against the walls, the stage was set. The world outside remained oblivious, the valley silent beneath its shroud of white. But within the Lafferty compound, the first tremors of something monstrous had begun to stir, tremors that would soon shake the very foundations of Hollow Creek and leave scars that would never fully heal. The first true fracture in the surface of daily life came quietly, almost reverently, as if the world itself were holding its breath. It began with a voice in the night, a voice that claimed to be not of this earth, but of the heavens. Obadiah, in the dim glow of a single candle, announced to his household that he had received a revelation. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of unease through the rooms. He spoke of an angel, a messenger who had visited him in dreams, bearing instructions for the purification of the soul and the body. The family listened, some with awe, others with a silent, growing dread. With every syllable, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, as if the house itself recoiled from the message. The rituals that followed were At first, little more than extended prayers and new rules for daily conduct. But soon, the boundaries of the familiar began to blur. Obadiah's instructions grew more elaborate, more invasive. He demanded that every member of the household participate in dawn ceremonies, their bodies and minds laid bare before the eyes of the divine. The children, once allowed the freedom of play, were now summoned to kneel in the cold, their voices trembling as they recited verses they barely understood. The wives, too, were drawn into the orbit of their husband's newfound authority, their days measured by the ticking of a clock that obeyed only his will. It was not long before the first whispers of unease began to circulate among those closest to the center. Rebecca, the second wife, noticed the change in the household's rhythm, the way laughter had vanished, replaced by a brittle silence that cracked at the slightest provocation. She confided in Sarah, her voice barely more than a breath, that she feared the line between faith and fear had been crossed. Sarah, younger and less certain, could only nod, her eyes wide with the knowledge that something sacred had been twisted into something else. The evidence of this transformation was subtle, but undeniable. The meals grew simpler, the conversations shorter. The children's eyes darted to the corners of rooms, as if expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. The house, once filled with the warmth of shared labor and quiet companionship, now echoed with the sound of footsteps in empty halls. According to the recollections of a neighbor who visited only once, there was a heaviness in the air, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for something to happen. That visitor never returned. As the days passed, the rituals intensified. Obadiah began to speak of purity, not just of the spirit, but of the flesh. He insisted that modesty was a barrier to true communion with the divine, and that only by casting aside earthly shame could the family achieve salvation. The ceremonies became more intrusive, more demanding. The family was required to bathe together in water blessed with herbs and oils, their bodies exposed to the scrutiny of both their patriarch and the unseen angel he claimed to serve. The children, confused and frightened, obeyed without question, their resistance worn down by the relentless pressure of obedience. Miriam, ever watchful, began to record these changes in her diary. She wrote of the way her father's eyes seemed to burn with a feverish light, of the way her mother's hands shook as she prepared the evening meal. She described the hush that settled over the house after each ceremony, a quiet so profound it seemed to erase all sound. She wrote, too, of her own fear, a fear that grew with every passing day. As the rituals became more extreme and the boundaries of the possible shifted, the pressure within the household mounted, each day bringing new demands, new rules, new punishments for those who failed to comply. The children, once lively and curious, became shadows of themselves, their laughter replaced by a wary silence. The wives, too, withdrew into themselves, their eyes downcast, their voices barely audible. The house became a crucible, its inhabitants tested and retested, their spirits bent but not yet broken. It was during one of these ceremonies that the first true act of rebellion occurred. Ezekiel, the eldest son, hesitated when ordered to recite a passage he could not remember. Obadiah's response was swift and merciless, a public rebuke, followed by hours of isolation in a darkened room. The message was clear. Obedience was not optional. and doubt would be punished. The other children watched in silence, their fear deepening, their hope fading. Outside the walls of the compound, the world continued as it always had, oblivious to the storm gathering within. But inside, the tension was palpable, a living thing that crept through the halls and settled in the corners of every room. The wives whispered to one another in the darkness, their words laced with fear and longing for a world they could barely remember. The children clung to one another, seeking comfort in the only way they knew how. The escalation was relentless. Obadiah's sermons grew longer, his demands more severe. He spoke of sacrifice, of the need to prove one's faith through acts of devotion that defied understanding. The ceremonies, once confined to the privacy of the home, began to spill into the courtyard, visible to the most loyal follower who had taken up residence in the outbuildings. These followers, drawn by the promise of spiritual enlightenment, became both witnesses and enforcers, their presence a constant reminder that escape was impossible. Miriam's diary became more urgent, her entries more frantic. She wrote of the bruises that appeared on her siblings' arms, of the nightmares that haunted their sleep. She described the way her father's voice changed during the ceremonies, taking on a tone that was not his own. She wrote of the fear that gripped her heart, a fear that grew with every passing day. As the rituals became more extreme and the possibility of rescue faded, the breaking point came on a night when the wind howled around the compound, rattling the windows and sending shadows dancing across the walls. Obadiah gathered his family and followers in the temple, his eyes alight with a fervor that bordered on madness. He announced that the angel had revealed a new commandment, a commandment that would require the ultimate act of faith. The family listened in stunned silence as he described the ritual of sacred union, a ceremony that would bind them together in body and spirit, erasing the boundaries that separated them as individuals. The shock was immediate and profound. Martha, the first wife, wept openly, her tears falling into the basin of blessed water she held in trembling hands. Rebecca and Sarah exchanged glances of horror, their faces pale with fear. The children, too young to understand the full implications, sensed that something terrible was about to happen. Miriam felt her stomach clench with dread, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend the enormity of what her father was proposing. Obadiah's words were delivered with the certainty of a man who believed himself chosen, his voice rising and falling in a cadence that mesmerized and terrified in equal measure. He spoke of the need to cast aside all earthly shame, to stand before God as they were created pure, unashamed, united. The ritual, he insisted, was the final step in their purification, the act that would guarantee their place in the celestial kingdom. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Each member of the family was lost in their own private hell, contemplating what the night would bring. Miriam, her heart pounding, resolved to document every detail, to bear witness to the truth no matter the cost. She knew that the events of this night would change everything, that the boundaries of the possible had been forever altered. As the ceremony began, the air in the temple grew thick with incense and fear. Obadiah moved among his family, his hands lingering on their shoulders, his eyes burning with a hunger that had nothing to do with spiritual enlightenment. The followers watched in silence, their faces masks of devotion and dread. The ritual unfolded with a terrible inevitability, each step more shocking than the last, each command more impossible to refuse. In that moment, the true nature of the darkness that had taken root in Hollow Creek was revealed not as an external threat, but as a force that had grown from within, nurtured by silence, obedience, and the unchecked power of a single man. The consequences of that night would echo far beyond the walls of the compound, leaving scars that would never fully heal, and setting in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. But the horror did not end with the ritual itself. In the days that followed, the atmosphere within the compound shifted from dread to numbness. The children moved through their routines like sleepwalkers, their eyes vacant, their voices flat. The wives, once bound together by shared suffering, now seemed isolated even from one another, each retreating into her own private world of grief and shame. Obadiah, for his part, appeared invigorated by the ordeal, his sermons taking on a new intensity, his demands growing ever more extreme. Miriam, shaken but unbroken, continued to write. Her diary became a chronicle of survival, a record of the ways in which the human spirit could bend without breaking. She described the small acts of kindness that persisted even in the darkest times, a gentle touch, a whispered word of comfort, a stolen moment of laughter. She wrote, too, of the growing sense of resistance that simmered beneath the surface, a quiet determination to endure, to remember, and, if possible, to escape. The outside world remained oblivious, the snow piling higher against the walls, the valley silent beneath its shroud of white. But within the Lafferty compound, the seeds of rebellion had been sown. The children, though traumatized, began to look to Miriam for guidance, sensing in her a strength that they could not name. The wives, too, found solace in her presence, drawing courage from her refusal to surrender to despair. Yet the danger was far from over. Obadiah's authority, though absolute, was not unchallenged. The very extremity of his demands had begun to sow doubt among his followers, some of whom whispered of leaving, of seeking help from the outside. The threat of violence hung over the compound like a storm cloud, its presence felt in every glance, every whispered conversation, every hurried step. According to later testimony from those who survived, it was during this period that the first plans for escape were formed. Miriam, ever resourceful, began to gather supplies, food, warm clothing, a small knife for protection. She studied the layout of the compound, memorizing the patterns of the guards, the timing of the rituals, the location of the keys. She wrote coded messages in her diary, instructions for her siblings should she be discovered. The tension within the compound reached a fever pitch. Every day brought new challenges, new dangers, new opportunities for resistance. The line between hope and despair grew ever thinner, the stakes ever higher. The darkness that had once seemed impenetrable now flickered with the faintest glimmer of light, a light that, if nurtured, might one day grow into a flame. And so, as the winter deepened and the snow continued to fall, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of faith, endurance, and the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. The events of those days would become the stuff of legend. whispered about in the years to come as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows and the courage required to face them. The first rays of dawn crept across the snowbound valley, casting long blue shadows over the compound. In that pale light, the world seemed suspended between nightmare and awakening. Yet within those walls, the truth could no longer be contained. The evidence, once hidden in whispers and glances, now demanded to be seen, to be reckoned with. It began with a single trembling hand, Miriam's slipping a battered diary from the lining of her coat, the leather worn soft by months of secret writing. Each page, dense with cramped script and coded marks, was a silent witness to the unspeakable. The ink, faded in places by tears and candlelight, mapped a descent into darkness that no one outside the compound could have imagined. The diary was not the only proof. There were bruises, carefully hidden beneath sleeves and collars, that told their own story. There were ritual objects, bowls stained with strange oils, scraps of cloth embroidered with symbols that no scripture sanctioned, a brass chalice whose rim bore the faintest trace of blood. In the cold, grey light, these artifacts lost their aura of sanctity and became what they truly were, evidence of a crime so profound it seemed to warp the very air around them. Forensic reports from the period, preserved in the archives of the territorial authorities, describe the scene with clinical detachment. Multiple implements of ritual use recovered. One document notes, bearing residues consistent with bodily fluids and herbal tinctures, signs of repeated use, evidence of physical trauma on minors consistent with prolonged abuse. The language is cold, but the reality it points to is anything but. The compound, once a fortress of faith, had become a crime scene. Testimony from the survivors, recorded in the weeks that followed, added flesh to the bones of the case. The children, their voices flat and eyes unfocused, recounted the ceremonies in halting detail. They spoke of being summoned in the dead of night, of being forced to participate in acts they could not understand, of punishments meted out for the slightest hesitation. The wives, their hands twisting in their laps, described the slow erosion of their will, the way obedience had become a form of survival. Each account was a thread in a tapestry of horror, woven so tightly that no one could claim ignorance or innocence. The most damning evidence, however, was not physical. It was the pattern, the method, the chilling consistency with which the rituals had been carried out. According to the analysis of Dr. Samuel Hayes, a physician called in to examine the survivors, the psychological conditioning was systematic and deliberate. The perpetrator employed isolation, deprivation, and religious justification to break down resistance and enforce compliance. The victims exhibited classic signs of trauma bonding and dissociation. Dr. Hayes's report, later cited in legal proceedings, would become a touchstone for understanding the mechanisms of cultic abuse. As the investigation deepened, more details emerged. Neighbors recalled seeing children with vacant stares, wives who flinched at sudden movements, followers who spoke in hushed tones of purification and sacred union. A supply merchant, who had delivered goods to the compound, remembered the way Obadiah's eyes seemed to bore through him, the way the children never met his gaze. It was as if they were afraid to be seen, he told investigators, afraid to exist. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. There could be no more denial. No more hiding behind the veil of faith. The truth, once glimpsed, could not be unseen. The authorities, armed with affidavits and physical proof, prepared to act. The stage was set for a reckoning. But before the machinery of justice could move forward, the final, shattering confessions began to surface. The survivors, emboldened by the presence of outsiders and the promise of protection, began to speak in voices that trembled but did not break. Martha, her face gaunt and eyes hollow, was the first to break the silence. In a voice barely above a whisper, she recounted the progression of the rituals, the way love had been twisted into obedience, obedience into complicity. He said it was God's will, she murmured, but it felt like dying, a little more each day. Rebecca, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles blanched, described the moment she realized there would be no rescue from within. We were all waiting for someone to stop him, she said, but we were too afraid. He made us believe that suffering was holy, that pain was proof of faith. Her words, recorded by a court stenographer, would later be read aloud at the trial, a litany of sorrow and betrayal. Sarah, the youngest wife, spoke of the children, how they had been used as instruments in rituals they could not comprehend, how their innocence had been bartered for the promise of salvation. Her testimony was punctuated by long silences, as if the act of remembering was itself a form of punishment. They told us to be grateful, she said, to thank him for choosing us, but I only felt empty. The children's confessions were the most harrowing. Ezekiel, his voice flat and affectless, described the punishments for disobedience, the endless cycle of hope and despair. Miriam, her diary now public record, read aloud passages that chronicled the descent into madness. I write this so someone will know, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. So someone will remember what happened here and never let it happen again. The full scale of the horror became clear. The rituals had not been isolated incidents, but a sustained campaign of psychological and physical domination. The followers, some complicit, some themselves victims, had enabled the abuse through silence and fear. The compound, once a sanctuary, had become a prison, a place where the boundaries between faith and fanaticism, love and cruelty, had been obliterated. The legal response was swift and uncompromising. The authorities, armed with irrefutable evidence and survivor testimony, moved to dismantle the remnants of Obadiah's regime. The compound was cordoned off, its buildings searched and catalogued, its artifacts seized as evidence. The followers were taken into custody, their roles scrutinized, their complicity weighed against their own suffering. Obadiah himself, the architect of the nightmare, was nowhere to be found. Some said he had fled into the mountains, others that he had perished in the final conflagration that consumed the temple. His absence became a symbol of the unresolved, the unpunished, the evil that slips through the cracks of human justice. Yet even in his absence, the machinery of accountability moved forward. The trial, held in the nearest town with a functioning courthouse, became a spectacle. Reporters from as far as Salt Lake City arrived to cover the proceedings, their dispatches painting a picture of a community in shock. The survivors, their faces pale but resolute, took the stand one by one, their voices weaving a tapestry of pain and endurance. The evidence was laid out in meticulous detail diaries, ritual objects, medical reports, sworn affidavits. The defense, such as it was, could offer only the thinnest of excuses: religious freedom, mistaken belief, the power of suggestion. The jury, confronted with the weight of proof, deliberated for less than a day. The verdict was unanimous. Those found complicit in the abuse were sentenced to lengthy terms of imprisonment. The children were placed in the care of relatives or, where none could be found, in the custody of the territorial authorities. The wives, their legal status uncertain, were offered the chance to start anew. Their names changed, their pasts sealed by court order. The compound itself was razed, its ruins left to the mercy of wind and snow. The social consequences rippled outward. Hollow Creek, once a byword for piety and self-reliance, became a cautionary tale. The neighboring settlements, shaken by the revelations, instituted new safeguards, mandatory reporting of suspected abuse, regular visits by territorial officials, the establishment of schools and churches open to outside scrutiny. The myth of the self-sufficient, unassailable community was shattered, replaced by a wary openness to the wider world. Yet the scars remained. The survivors, though freed from the immediate threat, carried the weight of memory with them. Some found solace in faith, others in the anonymity of distant cities. Miriam, her diary now a historical artifact, became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest places, the truth can find a voice. The children, their futures uncertain, became the focus of new efforts at healing and restoration. Dr. Hayes, whose testimony had been instrumental in the trial, established a fund for their care, enlisting the help of physicians and counselors from across the territory. The contrast between past and present was stark. Where once the compound had stood, only charred timbers and blackened earth remained. The valley, silent beneath its blanket of snow, seemed to mourn the loss of innocence, the betrayal of trust. Yet, in the midst of ruin, there were signs of renewal, a wild flower pushing through the ash, a child's laughter echoing in the distance, the slow, steady work of rebuilding. The story of Hollow Creek did not end with the verdict or the razing of the compound. It lived on in the memories of those who survived, in the records of the court, in the whispered warnings passed from parent to child. It became a lesson, a warning, a plea for vigilance, for in the end, the greatest danger was not the evil that lurked in the shadows, but the silence that allowed it to grow. And so, as the years passed and the valley healed, the legacy of those dark days remained a testament to the power of truth, the necessity of justice, and the enduring hope that even the deepest wounds can, in time, begin to mend. The collapse was not sudden, but inexorable, a slow unraveling of the fabric that had once held Hollow Creek together. In the aftermath of revelation, the community found itself stripped bare, its illusions scattered like ashes on the wind. The compound, once a symbol of unity and faith, now stood as a scar upon the land. Its charred remains were a mute testament to the dangers of unchecked power and blind devotion. The valley, for so long defined by its isolation, now faced the world beyond its borders. In doing so, it was forced to reckon with the darkness that had flourished in its midst. The process of rebuilding was neither swift nor simple. The survivors, each marked in their own way, faced the daunting task of forging new lives from the ruins of the old. Some left the valley altogether, seeking anonymity in distant towns where their names and faces meant nothing. Others remained, determined to reclaim their home from the shadow of its past. The land itself seemed to resist their efforts. Fields lay fallow, houses stood empty, and the air was thick with the memory of what had transpired. Even the seasons seemed altered. The winter lingered longer than before, as if the earth itself mourned the laws of innocence. Official records state that the authorities, wary of further unrest, maintained a presence in the valley for months after the trial. Patrols moved along the old roads, their lanterns flickering in the dusk, a visible reminder that the days of secrecy were over. New laws were enacted, new leaders appointed, and the rituals of daily life were reshaped by the need for transparency and trust. The church, once the heart of the community, was rebuilt with open doors and clear windows. Its sermons now echoed with calls for vigilance and compassion. Yet for all these changes, the wounds ran deep. Families were divided, friendships shattered, and the old certainties, faith, kinship, tradition were forever tainted by association. The children, placed with relatives or fostered by strangers, struggled to adapt to worlds that felt both safer and more alien than the one they had known. Some found solace in routine, others in silence. A few, unable to bear the weight of memory, vanished into the anonymity of the wider world, their stories lost to time. The valley itself became a place of uneasy pilgrimage. Outsiders arrived, drawn by rumors and newspaper accounts, their curiosity mingling with a kind of morbid reverence. Historians, journalists, and the merely curious walked the paths between the ruins, their footsteps stirring the dust of secrets not yet fully laid to rest. Some came seeking answers, others absolution, all left with the sense that something essential had been broken, something that could never be fully restored. Among those who remained, the work of healing was slow and uncertain. Dr. Hayes, whose testimony had helped bring the truth to light, established a small clinic in a neighboring town, dedicating himself to the care of those scarred by trauma. He kept meticulous notes, recording the progress of his patients with the same precision he had once applied to the investigation. Recovery, he wrote in one entry, is not a matter of forgetting, but of learning to live with what cannot be changed. The past is a wound that may never close, but it need not define the future. Miriam, whose diary had become the cornerstone of the case, found herself both celebrated and haunted. She was offered new beginnings education, employment, even the chance to change her name, but she carried with her the burden of survival, the knowledge that her escape had come at a terrible cost. In quiet moments, she would revisit the pages of her journal, tracing the lines of her own handwriting as if searching for a version of herself that had not been marked by horror. She became, in the eyes of many, a symbol of resilience, but in her own heart, she remained a witness, one who remembered, and who could not forget. The other survivors, too, bore their scars in ways both visible and hidden. Some found strength in community, gathering in small groups to share their stories and support one another. Others withdrew, their trust in the world irreparably damaged. The wives, whose roles had been so tightly circumscribed by obedience, struggled to define themselves anew. Some remarried, others chose solitude. All carried with them the memory of choices made under duress and the lingering question of what might have been. Yet even as the valley struggled to move forward, the past refused to release its grip. There were rumors, whispers of other secrets, other crimes that had gone unpunished. Some spoke of hidden rooms beneath the ruins, of journals never found, of followers who had vanished without a trace. Official investigations, though thorough, could not account for every absence, every unanswered question. The land itself seemed to conspire in the preservation of mystery, its forests and hills swallowing evidence as surely as they had once sheltered the faithful. Historians note that the legacy of Hollow Creek extended far beyond its borders. The case became a touchstone in debates over religious freedom, child protection, and the limits of community autonomy. Lawmakers cited it in arguments for reform, educators in lessons on the dangers of isolation and the importance of critical thought. The story was retold in books, lectures, and whispered warnings, its details shifting with each retelling, but its core message undiminished: that evil, when cloaked in righteousness, is all the more insidious for those who lived through it. However, the legacy was more personal. Nightmares lingered, trust was slow to return, and the simple rituals of daily life, lighting a lamp, closing a door, saying a prayer, were forever tinged with the memory of what had been lost. Some survivors found meaning in advocacy, working to prevent similar tragedies elsewhere. Others chose silence, their pain too raw for words. The valley, for all its beauty, remained a place of shadows, its peace hard won and never fully secure. And so the story endures, not as a closed chapter, but as a living question. What does it mean to seek justice when justice can never restore what has been taken? How does a community rebuild itself on the ruins of trust? Can the truth, once revealed, ever truly set anyone free, or does it simply exchange one kind of burden for another? In the end, the tale of Hollow Creek is not merely a record of crime and punishment, but a meditation on the fragility of goodness, the resilience of the human spirit, and on the dangers that lie in the spaces between faith and fanaticism. It is a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with violence or rage, but often arrives quietly, disguised as love, as duty, as the voice of God. Official records may close the case, but the questions remain. What secrets still lie buried beneath the ashes? What stories have yet to be told? And, perhaps most haunting of all, what darkness might yet take root in the hearts of those who believe themselves immune? As the years pass and the valley slowly heals, the memory of those days lingers, a warning, a lesson, a plea for vigilance. For in the end, the greatest threat is not the evil that lurks in the shadows, but the silence that allows it to grow. And so, as the last echoes of the past fade into the hush of the present, one question endures, unanswered and unanswerable. If you were the only one who knew the truth, would you have the courage to speak?